Today it's going to be about Henry VIII and his religious policies. I'm going to warn you now, it's going to be quite long. It's quite a bit. I'm not going to talk about his 6 wives because that's a whole nother video. But yeah, it's about Henry VIII's religion. So just warning you, it's going to be a long one. Although you probably know already by the length of the video. So, first of all, well, we all know dear Thomas Wolsey was Henry VIII's chief minister from 1515 to 1529. But, of course, Wolsey fell from power before he died. So, why did he fall from power? Well, all because of the King's Great Matter. Now, what was the King's Great Matter? Well, he wanted a son. The King's Great Matter is basically his desire for a son. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon, and he had Mary in 1516. But again, Mary was a daughter. He wanted a son. So what did he do? He tried to get an annulment. Well, he was very, very desperate. He even considered legitimizing his son Henry VIII's right. Sorry about that. He was legit desperate for his marriage to be annulled. Well, from 1527 to 1529, he sends Wolsey to talk with the Pope in order to try and annul it, arguing that it wasn't legal because Catherine had been married to his brother Arthur, but they never consummated the marriage, and then he married her, so it's not right. He should have married his brother's widow. So the Roman Emperor by this time is Charles V, as you already know, and the Pope, under the control of Charles, refused to grant the annulment. And there were court hearings, I'm going to get into that in a bit, discussions, and so the only option was to break from the church. Now, the reason why Wolsey fell from power was because he delayed these discussions. He tried to push it back as much as he could. And the king just at one point got fed up, said, okay, I've had it up to here. Go back to York, because Wolsey was the Archbishop of York. Go back to York and wait for a hearing. Then he got called to a hearing, but he died on the way. But that's basically the failure to obtain the divorce was what led Wolsey to his downfall. So, yeah. Well, I mentioned a court hearing, and that's actually what happened. The Legatine court was the court that was destined to discuss the King's Great Matter. I don't know why it's called the King's Great Matter, but it is, so let's deal with it. Well, it was open in January, well, not open, but it all started in January 1528. Well, France and England, as you probably already know, had declared war on Charles V. So the Pope, under the control of Charles V, would not let Wolsey was a papal legate too, so he would not let Wolsey issue things on his behalf. So in order to negotiate this, instead of just sending Wolsey, he sends Campeggio. So, Campeggio is another papal legate, but he comes from the Pope and has no loyalty to Henry. So that's like a good thing. Well, in June 1528, there is a sweating sickness in London, and it sweeps England, sending Anne Boleyn away. Now, Wolsey sees this as a sign from God saying, don't get the divorce. But Wolsey was torn between the Lord and his master, Henry. So it was a huge internal debate. Then the court officially opened on the 22nd of October of 1528. So quite a few months after Campeggio was sent. And he opens the proceedings with a papal bull. This papal bull, given to him by the Pope, secretly says that the marriage is annulled and the divorce is granted. Of course, the Pope told Campeggio, okay, you can authorize this if you consider it the right thing to do. So Campeggio ultimately decided it wasn't, but he had the power to grant the divorce. Wolsey does not manage to get this. The court fails, and Henry gets fed up, and like I said, sends Wolsey away. Well, the question is, by 1529 or 1528, because the court lasts quite a few months, Henry legitimately believes that his marriage is cursed by God. Well, the Bible apparently says that if a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be without children or sons. But of course, he had married his brother's wife. So he bent the thing, like, because in the it says without sons. Like the English version says without sons. Wait, no. No, it's in the original. I'm sorry. In the original text, it says without children. Now, Henry, and this is called the Leviticus text. Henry manages to find the original Hebrew and manages to find it says it shall be without sons. So he actually has an original text from the Bible saying that if he married his brother's wife, he would be without sons, even though the official English version says children. Of course, that doesn't serve him because he did have a child. He did have Mary. So he used this in court. That was his main argument. Well, now the actual stages to a divorce, well, they're these, like I'm gonna tell you now. In November 1529, the most important parliament in Tudor England, the Reformation Parliament, was opened. So Henry thought, okay, fine, you're not granting me a divorce. Okay, let me see what I can do. So he tried to find, instead of going through the church, going through legal means. So maybe he could wiggle a divorce out of some place. And then a few months later, in January 1530, Anne Boleyn's brother actually travels to Pope and to see Charles and begs for the divorce. Like, please, 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 please grant Henry VIII, grant Henry VIII a divorce. Please, because I want him to marry my sister. Of course, the Pope and Charles was related to Catherine of Aragon. They're like, yeah, right. You think we're gonna give you the divorce? No. So that failed. Then a few months later, in September of 1530, Richard Fox and Cranmer presented this theory with evidence that there were precedents for annulment. Annulment was an actual thing. So they managed to wiggle a little room for the church, for the crown to have influence over the church, therefore making Henry, putting Henry in control of his marital affairs. So using these precedents, they managed to get Henry in control of his marriage. In February 1531, well, I'm going to get into this in a bit, Henry was officially recognized as the supreme head of the church in England. In England, that's really important. Not head of the Church of England, head of the church in England, as far as the law of Christ allows. Now, it's important that it says in England, not of England, because by saying it's in England, it implies it's the Catholic Church. It's still the Pope, but it's just Henry's the head of the church in England, although the head of the church is the Pope. When eventually it does say the head of the Church of England, it implies that the actual church is still the Catholic Church. It's the Church of England, and the head of the Church of England, it's Henry. But right now, 1531, he's the head of the church in England as far as the law of Christ allows. And that little addition is really, really, really important. I'm going to get into it in a bit. Then, May 1532, there's the whole submission of the clergy. Again, don't worry, I'm going to explain it in a bit. Then, in December 1532, Anne suddenly became pregnant. So that happened. And then in January 1533, Archbishop Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, I think. He's Archbishop, it's fine, doesn't matter. He actually marries Anne and Henry. So technically by this point, Henry was married at the same time to Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn. So that's that. And then in April, he finally got the Cranmer to say that the marriage to Catherine was was invalid. And then his marriage to Anne Boleyn was made legal, and voila. And then Elizabeth was born in September, I think. So, the reason he married Anne Boleyn before the divorce was final was because he did not know how long it would actually take to get the divorce. He knew it was about to take place, of course, but he had already gotten her pregnant, and he couldn't have the child being born out of wedlock. So, of course, as soon as he could, he got married. As close to he couldn't marry her when she was 4 months pregnant, because then it would be obvious that the baby had been conceived out of wedlock. So she got pregnant in December. They got married in January. So 1 month, it would still be kind of believable that the baby was conceived in wedlock. Although, as to what extent the marriage was valid until he got divorced from Catherine, it's a bit iffy, but we're going to allow that. Sorry about my dog. Well, now we go on to the context of the change of the Reformation Parliament. Well, like I mentioned, from 1529, the king's grey matter became increasingly important in English politics. Wolsey, who had basically failed to achieve this, had been thrown from power and later died. So he would have been killed probably by Henry. But politicians in this time knew, they knew they had to get this, and he put increasing pressure on them. So he wanted, apart from the divorce, reduced fees paid for burials, and limit pluralism. But by 1531, instead of also putting pressure on his politicians, he also put pressure on the church. He threatened to charge all the clergy with Praemunire. He demanded a large fine for this, and he even demanded to be recognized as the head of the church in England. Okay. And then in 1532, Archbishop of Canterbury, Warham, died. So that was the final, a stable figure who refused to grant him the divorce. Now, this is kind of off topic and really funny to me. So, Wolsey, a fascinating figure, he managed to go from just a priest to Archbishop of York and papal legate. The only two positions in the Catholic Church he did not get were of the Archbishop of Canterbury and Pope. He was actually in the running to become Pope. He got a bit pushed out when Henry started becoming more radical against the church. But he was actually in the running to become Pope. Imagine, Wolsey Pope. And then the Archbishop of Canterbury, let's be honest, if Warham had died before Wolsey did, he probably would have been Archbishop of York and Canterbury. But Warham managed to hold on. Wolsey died, and then 2 or 3 years later, Warham himself died. So he managed to hold on. And the new Archbishop of Canterbury, like I said, was Cranmer, who was more flexible in his religious outlook. He was kind of progressive, and again, he did a whole marriage ceremony for Henry and Anne Boleyn. Well, so the Reformation Parliament, like I mentioned, is the most significant parliament of all the Tudor period. Even Elizabeth's later parliaments, the whole parliament with the Spanish Armada, yeah, that's important, but not as much as this. Yeah, the whole golden speech thing, yeah, it's important, not as much as this. Because yes, that was important, but nothing changed England like this one did. So now I'm going to explain to you what the actual Reformation Parliament achieved. It's quite a bit, so warning you. But in 1531, the Act of Pardon was passed, in which clergy basically said sorry to Henry VIII. So it was an apology by the clergy for not granting him his divorce. Again, he had threatened them with Praemunire, and he had scared them. So Canterbury, for example, Henry managed to squeeze money from the church. The large fines I mentioned. Canterbury paid him £100,000. Well, and again, Fisher, there's this religious guy, he recognized Henry VIII as head of the Catholic Church in England. Everyone recognized him as that. But Fisher was smart. He said, okay, I'm going to add this, as far as the law of Christ allows. Now, I've mentioned this before, and the reason it's so important is because the law of Christ is more of an idea, and if you as a priest don't believe that the law of the Christ allows Henry to be head of the church in England, you can still think of the head of the church as someone else. It's fine. If you do believe it's Henry, it's Henry. If not, it's fine. So that little addition, although not seemingly significant, it genuinely was. Then in 1532, it was the act of not the act. That's different. The submission of the clergy, in which the clergy basically submitted to Henry VIII, like the name suggests. Well, the clergy is like, okay, fine. But I mentioned that they managed to find loopholes, and now Henry managed to change canon law. He managed to change church legislation. That's what I mentioned before. That's with the submission of the clergy. So now Henry had control over these matters, and now he could authorize a possible marriage, which he did. Then in 1532, the Act of Restraint of Anitz was passed. Now, you may not know what Anitz are, and Anitz are payments to Rome, which are approximately 1 year's salary. Well, of course, Henry's like, oh no, I am not giving the church money. And you think, no, you can grant me my divorce and then I'll give you money. So he retained this money. He prevented the money from going to the Pope, and also managed to squeeze into this act the right to appoint bishops. So imagine a position for a bishop opened up. Well, Henry had the power to say, hey, quick question before you are accepted as bishop. Do you believe you can grant me the divorce? Or you can help grant me the divorce? If the bishop said yes, fine. If the bishop said, no, I'm not sure I can do that, then the bishop would not be harmed because he can't really do that. He said like, oh, I'm sorry, the position has been filled already. I'm sorry. And he could not appoint him, and he could appoint someone else. So he had the right to appoint bishops, which is kind of a big deal. At this point, he had control over canon law. So, well, again, bishops who disobeyed him were charged with Praemunire, which I know what it is, but I don't know how to explain it, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know how to explain it, so I'll put it in the description of the video. And it has a weird spelling. It's Praemunire, Praemunire. So yeah. Then remember how I mentioned the submission of the clergy? Well, later that year, the Act of the Submission of the Clergy was passed, which, I mean, the clergy submitted to Henry earlier that year, but this act made it final, made it official. And now literally, he has the public backing for this. The public really supported this act. So, public supported it, but not everyone did, including Thomas More. Who was Thomas More? Well, Thomas Wolsey, I really love this. Thomas Wolsey, he was chief minister from 1515 to 1529. he falls from power. Here comes Thomas More. Thomas More is chief minister from 2930 to 1532, when he resigns after the act of submission of the clergy, which he could not accept. Here comes Thomas Cromwell, another Thomas, who is chief minister from 1532 to 1539. The longest by far was Wolsey, but they're all Thomases. And spoiler alert, More would go on to be executed for reasons I will explain in a second. Cromwell was also executed for heresy and other things. And Wolsey would have been executed probably, but he died on the way to his trial. There's 3 chief ministers, 3 Thomases, 3 executions, although one wasn't actually carried out because he died before, but 3 executions, which is kind of a coincidence. So that's More. More resigned, he wasn't able to accept this. Now, next, the Act of Restraint of Appeals. Now, this is one of my favorite act, if that makes sense, of the whole Parliament. Of course, people who live in England could not, with this act, could not appeal to Rome over church matters. So this is actually really smart, and I would never have thought of this, I think. But, of course, he knew Catherine of Aragon was in contact with the Pope. So she constantly sent him letters saying, please don't grant him the divorce, please. And she appealed to the Pope, saying, please don't grant him the divorce, I beg you. Now with this act, now Catherine of Aragon could not contact the Pope. So he effectively stopped the letters from her to Pope, I forget the name. But it's actually really smart. She could not contact him, so she could not beg him for his support. So she didn't know if the Pope supported her or not. So that's a really clever step, and this was negotiated by Cromwell. So the whole Reformation Parliament is after Wolsey's downfall. The beginning is with More. The later half is Cromwell, and in religious reformation, the majority is with Cromwell, then the later part is without Cromwell because he falls from power too. Then in 1534, the Dispensations Act was passed, which, I mentioned how in the Act of Restraint of Anitz, these Anitz were stopped, but now with the Act of the Dispensations Act, everything stopped. Every payment. There were other payments, but all of them stopped with this act. So now, Henry was too busy. He was like, I'm too good for this. So now, he would go on to pass the power of deciding canon law to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest position in the church in England, of England. Not here, it's in England. In a few years, it's going to be of England. But it's not that he didn't want to pass canon law, it's just he passed it on to Cranmer. Now, Cranmer would do whatever Henry said, but it wasn't Henry himself who passed canon law, it was Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Well, literally all power of the church in England is on Henry's hands. And notice how I still mention church in England. It's still church in England. It gets to be a bit confusing because sometimes she said, oh, it's off England. No, that's not until 1534. Then, the first act of succession was passed in 1534, like I said. And by this point, Henry was already married to Anne Boleyn. So with this act, he made Mary basically illegitimate. She was now not able to inherit the crown. We know she did, but that's in the 1540s. That's not important right now. So now the children of Anne Boleyn would inherit the crown, preferably if they were if it was a boy. Now we all know Anne Boleyn did have one surviving child, Elizabeth, Queen of England too, but still. So Elizabeth was born in September 1533, and everyone had to swear an oath to keep the succession and to accept it. So it was basically like, now you're gonna swear an oath too. Fun, enjoy. Of course, if you did not accept this oath, it would be considered as treason. So that was not fun. You can accept the succession or you can die. Of course, this treason was more noble. But yeah. And at this point, Elizabeth, she was born, and she was obviously a girl. And of course, the law of succession says that a boy would go on to inherit the throne. So even if Anne Boleyn had no other children, instead of Mary, who traditionally would be the next queen, it was going to be Elizabeth. So Elizabeth right now was the apparent heir to the throne. Then in 1534, the Act of Supremacy was passed, which was now declared Henry was now head of the church in England and of England. Yeah, he was now head of the church in and of England. He was the supreme head. It's not like the head of the church, it's the supreme head of the church. Really like over the top, exaggerated. And now Cromwell was made this really fictitious religious post called the Vicar General. It was completely fictitious and not fictitious. It was a new post, not existent before, because otherwise Wolsey would have had it. But yeah, he gave this to Cromwell to help him run the church. So this basically formalized the Break from Rome. Then the Act of First Fruits and Tenths. So first fruits were first payments, were like a religious post, and tenths were like a part of the church's income. So instead of being payments to Rome, like I had said, like that was starting the Act of Dispensations, 1534. The Act of First Fruits and Tenths stopped all papal taxes. There's a difference. There's a difference. And basically asserting his financial power and position over the church. And then, in 1534, the Treason Act was passed. Now, remember the Act of Succession, in which it was an oath? Well, this Treason Act passed in the same year, mind you. It solidified the oath. So if you did not accept this, if you refused to take this oath, you could be executed. Just like that. And also any criticism, spoken or written, were against. So there were treason. You can speak out against Henry. Or the church. Of the Church of England, not the Catholic Church. You could speak whatever you want about the Catholic Church. So, it created fear in noble families, although it didn't target common folk, including More. Thomas More was executed because of this, because he refused to take the oath of succession, because he did not accept Elizabeth as the next queen. He would accept Mary. And yeah, it's kind of ironic how Henry, at the beginning of his Reformation Parliament, it's outrageous how the church, like the Pope and the Catholic Church is getting money from the people. How dare they? Here he is in 1534, it's like 3 or 4 years later, accepting money, 2 or 3 years later, accepting money from the people as like payment. It's kind of, because the Act of First Fruits and Tenths, he took those taxes. He didn't stop them, he took them. So yeah, that's the Reformation Parliament. And there were like kind of several approaches to this Reformation Parliament. It was one to attack the church, to weaken the resistance. This is especially 1530 to 1532. Then to remove the powers of the Pope, 1533. To establish king as the supreme head of the church, 1534. And then to destroy opponents, 1533 onwards. So that's that. Now, all this change, instead of being clerical, instead of being by the church, it was all completely legal. he used a Reformation Parliament. He was smart. He said, okay, I cannot get it through the Pope, so I'm going to use the Parliament. And he did, and he was actually really successful doing this. So now I am going to tell you all about his religious changes he would go on to do later on. Now, these religious changes are a result of the Reformation Parliament, and without the Reformation Parliament, these changes would have never happened. But I did warn you it was going to be a long video. We're 30 minutes in, and I still have quite a bit to go, so I mean, it's religion under Henry VIII. What do you expect? He was the guy who broke from Rome. Anyway, in 1534, we start a little journey. That's when the Reformation Parliament ends. So, Elizabeth Burton, the Holy Maid of Kent, was executed that year under the Treason Act. She had supporters and was deposed by Act of Attainder. And again, she was arrested. She was arrested and executed for refusing to take the oath of succession. Which in 1532, yeah, if you didn't take the oath, it was suspicious. It was treason. But I think the most you could get was arrest. Then in 1534, it was execution. But by 1532, it was already treason. She was executed in 34. Then, the Valor I don't know how to pronounce this. Valor Ecclesiasticus was set up by Cromwell. It was a survey which he would go around monasteries and churches and other religious buildings assessing their wealth. He would go around and said, "Oh, this is looking okay, not too bad. Okay, yeah, this is not looking good." Even though they were okay, they were doing fine. The results were kind of tampered with because they were encouraged to look for things that were wrong instead of things that were right. And then that same year, the 10 Articles was a piece of religious requirement law, which was passed in 1535, like the Valor Ecclesiasticus. These 10 Articles only allowed for baptism, penance, and the Eucharist. So baptism is when you're born, penance is confessing, and Eucharist is the whole transubstantiation thing with the wine and I forget the name, but you know what I mean. That, and that was only the only sacraments allowed. Out of the 7 sacraments, it was these 3. So you could only pray to saints and for things other than remission. And the definition of what a Eucharist was kind of ambiguous, so that was a bit, Henry, what you doing? So then, that was 1535. Now, 1536 is a big year for the church. 1536, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, sorry. The 10 Articles were passed in 1536. Yeah, it makes so much sense now. Okay, I'm sorry, I apologize. The 10 Articles, what I just explained, was passed in 1536. What was passed in 1535 were the executions of More and Fisher. Like, you know Fisher, the guy who added as far as the love of Christ allows. Well, the Pope knew after he added that. He's like, "Oh, Fisher, you stupid. I know you meant. I know you didn't you did it not to hurt anyone, just for your own sake, but like for the church, not for your own thing. But why did you do that? He's gonna come after you. You're stupid." So he made him cardinal. Now he was Cardinal Fisher. Now, Henry's like, "Oh, you made him cardinal. Wow, that's such a big deal, right? Yeah, wow. I'm gonna execute him anyway, so he's not safe. I know what you were trying to do. Did not work. If only you had granted me the divorce. Whoops." So he executed Fisher using that argument and more because of the act of treason. In 1536, as I said, the 10 Articles and the biggest rebellion in Tudor England, the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now, I'm not going to get into that now because that's for another video, but it's basically the main motive was the dissolution of the monasteries, which I'm going to introduce here in a bit, and then I'm going to mention it further on. But it was unhappiness and anger over certain aspects. And in 1536 too, it was the royal injunctions, which I've noticed every single monarch in Tudor England had royal injunctions. Henry did. Except Henry VII, I'm sorry. Henry VIII did 2 sets. Edward, he did 2, if you want to know more about Edward's religious policies and what his royal injunctions were. Go watch my video on him. Religion under the Boy King. Anyway, Mary also had royal injunctions, and Elizabeth also had royal injunctions. So, but yeah, there were 2 sets. They were both in 36 and 38. I'm just gonna read them both now because it makes no sense only reading 36 and then 38. Well, by 1536, it took away some of the religious holidays and discouraged pilgrimages. And by 1538, now pilgrimages and the veneration of relics were condemned as words devised by men's fantasy, so not really acceptable. And if you were caught doing these, you had to publicly recant and publicly apologize and say, "Oh no, I'm sorry." But yeah, that was that. And that's 1536. Then 1538, the Bishop's Book was passed. Now, so far, all of the acts that I've mentioned, I skipped. Hold on. I skipped the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry, by 1536, Henry allowed Cromwell to take with about ecclesiasticus, send inspectors to monasteries, and some of them were closed, especially those below the income of £200, if it were closed in 1536. Now, I'm going to get into that in a bit, that's why I kind of skipped it accidentally, but yeah. In 1537, like I was saying, all that I mentioned up to now is really more Protestant doctrine. Now, the Bishop's Book was kind of Catholic. Now, in a religious roller coaster, which I think best exemplifies how religion in Tudor England was played, I believe Henry VII is just on the platform waiting to go on. And religion was there, but it wasn't his main objective. He was just observing. Henry VIII got on the platform, and he was in the middle, a bit higher up, because of course you need to go down in a roller coaster. So he was a bit higher up. Then Edward came, and it was Protestant, very Protestant. Now Mary came, and it was all the way up, Catholic. And then Elizabeth, Protestant leaning, quite Protestant, but not extreme, but lower than Henry. So Henry did have some Catholic tendencies, and the Bishop's Book of 1537, which restored the 4 missing sacraments of the 10 Articles, was one of them. So the 10 Articles, it removed 4 sacraments, and then it was such outrage that the following year they restored them. Now, 1538, like I mentioned, the royal injunctions, so I'm not going to read them again, and then the Bible was in English, so everyone was now able to read the Bible because it was in English and it was accessible. Literally everyone, there was a copy in every church. And if I'm not mistaken, by 1538, Henry was excommunicated from the church. That means that it's basically the Pope's way of saying, anyone who wants to invade England, who wants to make it Catholic, please come, please invade. So that kind of put Henry in a bit of a difficult position, because he was facing a threat from other Catholic nations now. And then the following year, the second act of the dissolution of the monasteries was passed. Again, closing all the monasteries. Don't worry, I'm going to get into that in a bit. The following year, 1540, Cromwell was officially executed because it was a blow to Protestantism, because Cromwell was a firm believer in Protestantism and really pushed a lot of Protestant policies, but he went a step too far. Then the whole shamble with the marriage of Anne of Cleves. He got too far, he got arrested and executed for, I think it was for heresy, kind of. I'm not sure, I haven't read that much on the details of Cromwell's execution, but That's that. Then, 1541, 1542, not much happened there, that I recall. And then in 1543, a couple things happened. The King's Book was published. Now, I mentioned the Bishop's Book, and here's the King's Book. Well, the Bishop's Book is basically a revision. The King's Book was basically a revision of the Bishop's Book, stating the necessary doctrine of an erudition of a Christian man. Catholic leaning, the Bishop's Book was Catholic leaning itself, but then the King's Book was also Catholic leaning, if that makes sense, just was revised. Then, the same year, the Act for the Advancement of True Religion, which was passed, which basically restricted the access to the Bible. The Bible in English had been passed in 1538, and now a few years later, 5 years later to be precise, the Act for the Advancement of a True Religion made the Bible only available, still in English, but only available to upper class males. So men, wealthy men. That kind of defeats the whole purpose of the Bible in English, making it available in every church. So there's obviously a blow to Protestantism as well. But don't worry guys, Protestantism is coming back. By 1545, the King's Primer was passed, replacing all Catholic Book of Prayers, and it was written by Cranmer, Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, who eventually gets killed by Mary. But for now, he's there. And then 1546, the Chantries Act was passed. So I mentioned the Chantries Act in my Edward video because it was passed officially in 1546, late 46, and Henry dies in January 1537. No, 1547, I'm sorry. So he dies before it even gets into effect, but don't worry guys, it does happen just under Edward. So that's the official church doctrine Henry passes. Now, I could get into the wives, like I mentioned, because that is religion-based, and especially the King's Great Matter, but if I do a video on the wives, I do want to analyze every single one of them. So I'm going to save that for some other time. So yeah, now this is the last part of the video. I think I'm not going to bore you with anything else, because by this point we've done 42 minutes, which is quite a bit. But I still have over 50 minutes left, so it's going to be an hour-long video. Good for you. Well, what's the context of monasteries in England by 1536? 36 was the lesser monasteries. 39 was the larger monasteries. Well, by this point, there were 800 religious houses in England and 100 in Scotland, which essentially owned 1/3 of all land in England. 1/3. Quite a bit. Leaving 2/3 to the nobility and the crown. So Henry's like, why should they have 1/3 of the land? Monasteries are the same thing as abbeys, priories, cells, nunneries. So I think I always mention them, I always name them monasteries, but if you hear me call them any of these names, it's the same thing. Like Westminster Abbey is basically Westminster Monastery. That makes sense. Anyway, they could in theory be closed or open, and 10% of all men in England, 10% of all male population were monks. Wow. Nowadays, I think it's like even way less than 1%. Back then it was 10%. Many did come from wealthy backgrounds. However, not all were monks by vocation. It's here in England, where it was primogeniture, which ruled, basically saying that the oldest son would get everything. So if you were a noble, and you had, say, 5 kids, 3 men. The women would just be married off to another noble, so you don't have to worry about them. But now you have the 3 sons. Now the oldest one would get everything, the land, the title, everything. Then you have another guy who could just help you, like not help you, but help the other son. But then what do you do with the third one? Well, what do you do? So you'd send them to a monastery and they become monks. That's why the figure of monks was so high, because most of them were not even there by choice. It was the only way to go. And they did take oaths of celibacy, vows of celibacy, so they basically can have sex or get married. Which was nowadays you tell someone if they can't have sex or get married, then they get mad. But back then, it was seen as like serving God and helping the greater good. So, and that was the idea. Like, monks were essential in the belief of purgatory. They played a really important role in the whole existence of it, saying that if you said enough prayers for the dead, those you loved would go on to heaven or hell, especially to heaven. And they had these chantries specifically for praying to the dead, and they were abolished later on. But yeah, when Henry VII died, mind you, this is 1509. Henry was still defender of the faith. That was 1520s, but Henry was still a devout Catholic. Same Henry who broke from the church. But when Henry VII died, there were over 10,000 prayers said for his soul. So monks and nuns you could either be Benedictine, Cistercians, or Carthusians. So those are basically different types. And now I am going through. It's a lot of pages. On friars. Friars were Carmelites, Dominicans, Franciscans, and yeah. So that was basically the types of monks. And now you're Henry, and you see these monasteries, and you're like, with monks and friars, and you're like, I want to dissolve this. Why do you want to dissolve this, you may ask? Well, let me just tell you. Well, he wanted to reduce the power of the Catholic Church and gain money. Essentially. He was the head of the church by then, but still the Catholic Church did have influence. There's still Catholicism present in England. The official religion of the state is Protestantism, but still. Well, these commissioners sent by Cromwell went there to assess the monasteries, and they found alleged cases of gluttony, indulgences, lust, drinking, completely illegal, not illegal, completely not allowed by the church. Does that make sense? So that helped in closing them down. Well, sorry for that sound. I don't know why. I don't know if you can hear it, but yeah, sorry. Well, what was the impact of the dissolution of the monasteries? Well, it had an impact in society, causing the pilgrimage of grace, in the economy, causing more land available. So, yeah, more land for farming, but also more land for enclosure, which was a huge problem. Then these buildings, these monasteries that were abandoned, and now they were left in ruins. They had no one there to care for them. Monks and nuns had nowhere to live, and nuns suffered especially. So after the closure of the lesser monasteries, some monks were allowed to live in the larger monasteries. And when these were closed, that was kind of a big problem. Culture. Well, when these were closed, it basically showed how people really depended on these monasteries. So, for example, the monasteries were used as a place for education and for copying manuscripts, and now these spaces had been destroyed. There were no place to learn these things. Then the nobility, well, Henry increased his power, and also the power of some of the nobility. So, it managed to get them to buy more lands, essentially. And Henry himself, he has more money to go to war. The monasteries, yeah. It's about the religious significance behind. But he did not do it because of religion. He did it because he wanted money for the war, for like 1536. I mean, he wasn't in one of the French wars by this point, but he was planning wars, and can't blame the guy. It was a really efficient way of getting a ton of money. So, like I said, like I mentioned before, the Valor Ecclesiasticus was this census of the church, the census, and to assess the wealth, and they were named like visitations. So it was also to assess how. But there were two steps: the spiritual check and financial assessment. The spiritual check is where they checked for drinking, lust, gluttony, all that. Then the financial assessment was basically to find out the wealth of the church and how the crown can increase its own wealth, and sort out which monasteries were worth more and which ones were worth less, and that deal. So, yeah, now I am going to get into the actual dissolution of the monasteries. This is the last thing, I swear. This is the last piece of paper I'm going to read, and I think we can get this in under an hour. So let's do this. Well, like I said, why dissolve the monasteries? Well, first of all, monastic orders were controlled by foreign Catholic orders. Not Henry. Henry did not control these monasteries. He did control the normal people, but not monks and nuns. These were controlled by Catholics in France, Spain, and Italy, especially Italy. Well, these monks and nuns, they weren't normal people. Their religious obligation was not to Henry and the Church of England, it was to the Catholic Church. So, of course, it was wealthy institutions in England taking orders from above. No good. No good. Then, again, for reformers, they represented the corruption and the wealth of the Catholic Church. Which, I mean, I think I've mentioned this before, but in terms of Catholic v. Protestant, I'm not religious, but I do lean towards Protestantism in the sense that I don't believe you need all that decoration and all that glorifying of Christ and the angels and that kind of thing, because it's the connection that counts rather than anything else. So that's what I believe. Then, again, the fourth and possibly most important reason for the closure of these monasteries was because their wealth could be a useful thing for the crown. Especially if there was a threat of Catholic invasion, like Henry genuinely thought it was, France and Spain. If he could, first of all, damage Catholic institutions, and secondly, get a lot of wealth out of it, oh hell yeah, he's gonna do that. So, in 1533, he announces his intention to dissolve the monasteries for revenue purposes, of course. In 1834, proposals were made, and some church lands were confiscated, as you probably know. I hope you do. 1535, these visitations of the Valor Ecclesiasticus, it were several people, but mainly six chancellors, and it was to confirm corruption and to assess the church wealth. However, yeah, the evidence was kind of exaggerated, so that's that. Then in 1536, the act of the dissolution of the lesser monasteries was passed, which meant that all monasteries, like I mentioned, under that were worth under £200 were closed. The pension was taken from monks, and it kind of strengthened larger monasteries. So this, he was able to argue that he was doing this for the good of the bigger monasteries, to strengthen them, As of course, he was only interested in strengthening the larger monasteries. Anyway, it was presented as reforming and improving standards. So like I said, it's It's that Henry, he sold it like, yeah, we're closing these smaller monasteries. And you may be panicking because, oh no, we're closing monasteries, how dare we? But in reality, it was like, okay, sorry, how dare we? No, it's fine. We're going to just reform them, and like, yeah, we're going to close those so you can get better, larger monasteries. But in reality, it was just, yeah, we're closing these for now. You can move over to larger monasteries. It's fine. Don't worry. But now we're going to close those. So 1537, some monasteries voluntarily surrender. Like lose as a turning point. Anyway. So by 1538, out of the original 399 religious houses, it's different than the 800 monasteries. But religious houses were 299, and now there were 202 remaining. And they will be dissolved in the next 16 months. 1538, the act of dissolution of the greater monasteries already confirms what had already happened and dissolved the rest. Just the rest were taken away. And in 1540, Waltham Abbey is the last to go. Like I said, abbey is basically the same as monastery in terms of religious houses. So in 1530, 800 religious houses had existed for over 500 years with around 9,000 people. And then by 1540, all monasteries were dissolved. And get this, they managed to get income raised from, by 1548, £120,000 to £250,000. And by 1547, £1.3 million. 1.3 million pounds. So that's religion under Henry VIII. I'm going to try and wrap this up in less than 3 minutes because I think an hour video is way too long. Anyway, that was religion in Henry VIII. It's a it's a whole roller coaster in the Tudor period, but especially in Henry VIII, it is a roller coaster in itself. There's a question of if he was more Catholic by the end of the reign, more Catholic or Protestant. At the beginning, he was definitely Catholic. There's really no doubt about it. He was 100% a Catholic. By the end, however, he was like, in the middle, he was really Protestant, and by the end, there's a debate. I do think he was Protestant leaning. He was not Catholic or Protestant leaning. Because if you notice, most of the church legislation is passed 1530, 1534. That's because it's important to him. 1536, when Anne Boleyn dies, that's not important anymore. He doesn't really care that much. So the whole church matter dies down. So yeah, that's pretty much religion under Henry VIII. I would sum up more, but there's not that much time left, and yeah. And thank you for watching. I hope it was useful, and yeah, just quick one-sentence summary. Religion under Henry VIII was a roller coaster in itself. It constituted both Catholic and Protestant policies, especially Protestant in the middle. But again, it was not because of his own beliefs, it was because of his interests. So he did lose interest in religion by the end. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching.